about parents? It's a question that's been debated forever, and we're diving deep into it today.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
We get a ton of interesting sources for this deep dive, like discussions from Reddit, articles from Thought Catalog, and Global English Editing, even some stuff from ChristianMingle.com.
A pretty diverse mix for sure.
It'll give us a good overview.
Yeah.
So, jumping right in, a lot of what we read, especially on Reddit in that Christian Mingle article, really push this leave and cleave idea.
Right, like when you get married, you're basically leaving your original family and forming a new one with your spouse.
Makes sense. And they even use this quote, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." What do you think about that, though? Like, are you supposed to completely separate from your family?
It's interesting because obviously lots of people still have close relationships with their parents after they get married. It's not always so black and white.
Definitely. And some people on Reddit actually shared stories about choosing their spouse over their family, even when it was really hard,
Wow, that's commitment.
right? But then again, we saw some pretty strong arguments against that whole idea, too.
Yeah, like in the Are No Stupid Questions thread and a blog post by Rachel Rainbolt, they talk about how the bond between a parent and child is super strong and unconditional. They even said something like, you can always get remarried, but you only have one mother. Hard to argue with that.
True. And it's not just emotions, right? Kids literally depend on their parents, but spouses are adults and should be able to take care of themselves.
That's true. It makes you think about where you draw the line. But then the Global English Editing article we read, it brought up this whole psychological aspect. Like, they said people who put their parents above their spouses often have certain traits.
Oh, yeah, they talked about that sense of obligation to your parents.
Right, like maybe feeling like you need to pay them back for everything, or just because of how you were raised.
And they also mentioned how culture plays a big role. Like, in some cultures, respecting your parents above all else is just ingrained in society.
Exactly, and that can create a lot of pressure. Even if you don't live in that culture anymore, you might still feel guilty if you don't put your parents first. So it's like we have these two sides, leave and cleave, with the spouse coming first, and then the strong parent-child connection that's hard to ignore.
And then there's Matthew Frey from the Thought Catalog article. He says prioritizing your spouse is the only way to have a strong marriage and raise good kids.
He's definitely not holding back. He says if you put anyone or anything above your spouse, you're basically asking for trouble.
Yeah, he even says in marriage, either your spouse is #1 or you're doing it wrong. But what I thought was interesting was how he ties that to your kids. He says when kids see their parents putting each other first, it teaches them about healthy relationships.
It's like it sets a good example.
Right. He's saying that a happy marriage actually creates a better environment for kids to grow up in.
It makes you think about whether putting your kids first all the time is really the best thing for them.
I know. It's not an easy question. He even says that putting your spouse first ultimately benefits everyone in the family, even your parents. But then again, what if your parents are getting older and need more help? Wouldn't neglecting them actually cause more stress in the marriage?
That's a good point. It seems like finding a balance is key.
Yeah, and that's what some of the other sources pointed out too. Like, real life isn't always so simple.
Right. Sometimes your priorities have to shift depending on the situation.
And I think a lot of people would agree that a healthy relationship shouldn't feel like you're constantly having to choose.
Definitely. Love for one person shouldn't mean you love someone else any less.
It's not about competition. It's about finding a way for everyone to feel loved and respected.
Exactly. It's about creating a harmonious environment where everyone feels valued.
So think about it. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to balance the needs of your spouse and your parents? How did you handle it? What factors did you consider?
Because like we said, there's no right answer here. It's about figuring out what works for you, your partner, and your family.
It's about finding that balance, right? And that's where communication comes in. Like, it's super important to talk to your spouse and to your parents about all of this.
Yeah, communication is key. On multiple levels, really.
Okay, so let's start with talking to your spouse. What kind of things should you be discussing to make sure you're both on the same page about this whole parent-spouse thing?
Well, the first thing is to be honest about what you both expect. Like, what does putting each other first actually mean to you? How would you handle it if your families need help, or if you have to choose between spending time with them or your spouse?
Yeah, because it's easy to say, oh, my spouse comes first. But then something comes up, like your mom needs help moving, or your brother's going through a divorce, or you've got crazy deadlines at work. Like, how do you actually put your spouse first when stuff like that happens.
That's why it's so important to talk about those things ahead of time. Not wait until you're already stressed out and resentful. It's like, check in with each other, like, hey, my mom wants us to come over for dinner again this weekend. How are we feeling about that? Or my sister's going through a tough time and I want to be there for her. How can we make that work without neglecting our time together?
It's like having a plan. Right. So you're
Yeah.
both prepared. And it's not just about the logistics either, right? It's also about being emotionally supportive.
Hmm.
Like, if your partner is having a hard time with their parents, how can you support them while still prioritizing the marriage?
Totally. It's about being empathetic. Like, I get why this is hard for you. I'm here for you. We'll figure this out. That we part is really important. You're a team.
Right. You're not taking sides against their family,
Mm.
but you're also not just giving in to keep the peace.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's talking to your spouse. What about talking to your parents? That can be a little trickier.
Definitely. Especially if they have different expectations or if they're used to being the most important people in your life.
Yeah, it can be hard to have that conversation, but it's
Yeah.
important.
It is. It's not about saying you don't love them anymore. It's about explaining that things are different now that you're married. Your priorities have shifted.
I could just imagine how nerve-wracking that conversation would be. Hey, mom and dad love you, but like, how do you even start that without it turning into a huge fight?
It's all about being respectful and honest, but also firm. Like, explain why you need to do this, reassure them that you still love them, but you're starting this new chapter and it means setting some boundaries.
Speaking of boundaries, that's what I wanted to talk about next. It's one thing to say, my spouse comes first, but how do you actually do that? Like, how do you set those boundaries with your parents?
It's tough, but consistency is key. You can't just say it, you have to actually follow through.
Give me some examples. Like, what does setting boundaries with your parents actually look like?
Well, it could be things like setting limits on how often you visit them or how much you share about your marriage. Or maybe you decide not to talk about certain topics that always lead to arguments. Or maybe you don't answer their calls when you're having dinner with your spouse.
That's a good one, the oversharing thing.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people vent to their parents about every little disagreement with their spouse, and then the parents feel like they need to get involved.
Exactly. And that's what you want to avoid. Another important boundary is around decision making. Like, you and your spouse should be making the big decisions together without feeling pressured by your parents.
Right, like where you live, how you spend your money, how you raise your kids, all that stuff.
Yeah, those are conversations for the two of you to have. It's about respecting each other's roles and understanding that you're building a life together, separate from your families. And if your parents try to cross those boundaries, you have to push back nicely but firmly.
Like, we appreciate your input, but this is our decision. Okay, so we've talked about communication and boundaries, but how do you actually manage to do both? Like, how do you honor your spouse and have a good relationship with your parents?
It's a balancing act for sure, but it's important to remember you don't have to choose one or the other. You can have both.
So it's not an either situation.
Yeah,
You can have a fulfilling marriage, Andy, a strong bond with your parents.
exactly. The key is finding a way to nurture both relationships in a healthy way. It's helpful to think of it like different circles, Your marriage is one circle and your family is another.
I like that. So your marriage is like its own little world with its own rules, and your family has their own thing going on too.
Right. And it's about respecting both of those circles without letting them completely overlap or crash into each other. Sometimes that means setting boundaries, maybe saying no to some things, or having those tough conversations.
Because, let's be real, sometimes families can be complicated.
They can. And it takes time and effort to figure out how to navigate those relationships in a new way. Plus, relationships are always changing.
That's true. Like, maybe when you first get married, your parents are super involved, and that's fine. But then you have kids, or you buy a house, and things need to change.
Exactly. And sometimes those changes happen naturally, but sometimes you have to be more intentional about it. Like, talk to your spouse and your parents about what needs to change and how to make things work. It's a conversation that's always evolving.
It's like a dance, right? You're constantly adjusting and communicating and finding that balance. And there's no one right way to do it.
Nope, every family is different. It's about finding what works for you and your partner and being patient.
Yeah, it's going to take time, and you're going to mess up sometimes. But the important thing is to keep talking to each other and figuring it out together. Okay, so you're doing all the right things, talking, setting boundaries, making sure everyone feels good. But then, bam, life throws you a curveball. Something unexpected happens that makes everything way more complicated.
Yeah, those big life events can really shake things up. It's when that whole spouse versus parents thing gets even tougher.
Right. Like what happens if someone loses their job or gets sick or there's a family emergency? All of a sudden, your priorities might have to change.
Exactly. And that's when you really need your support system.
Mm-hmm.
But when your spouse and your parents are part of that system, it can get messy fast. Like, how do you support your spouse when you also have to be there for your family?
It's like you're trying to juggle everything at once.
It can feel that way. But instead of thinking of it as me against them, try to think of it as you and your spouse against the problem. Like you're a team facing this challenge together.
Oh, I like that. So it's us against the problem, not me versus them.
Exactly. And as a team, you can talk about your options, figure out what's best for both of you, and maybe even get support from both families. But sometimes you might also need to set some temporary boundaries just to protect your marriage and your own sanity.
What would that look like, though? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say one of your parents gets really sick and needs a lot of help. You might have to spend more time with your family, even if it means your spouse gets a little less attention for a while.
That would be tough for the other spouse, though. I mean, it's easy to feel left out or resentful when your partner's focus shifts like that.
Definitely. And that's why communication is so important in those situations. You have to talk about how you're feeling, reassure each other, and find ways to stay connected even if you can't physically be together all the time.
So making time for phone calls, sending texts, maybe even squeezing in a date night here and there.
Exactly. It's about putting in the effort to keep your relationship strong, even when things are crazy.
Hmm.
And remember, most of these situations are temporary. Once things calm down, you can reevaluate and adjust those boundaries as needed.
It's all about being flexible, right? Rolling with the punches. But, it's not always the big stuff that causes problems. Sometimes it's the little things that can really start to wear on a marriage.
Oh, yeah, those little disagreements and annoyances can definitely add up over time.
Things like arguing about money or chores or how to raise the kids, or maybe even just your in-laws or some annoying habit your partner has. And when that happens, it's easy to vent to your parents about it. You want their advice, or maybe just to feel like someone's on your side. But how much is too much? When does talking to your parents about your marriage start to become a problem?
That's a tough one. Because on the one hand, it's good to have support outside of your marriage, but you don't want to involve your parents in every little fight you have with your spouse. It can make them feel like they have to pick sides, which is never good.
So how do you know if you're just venting or if you're actually bringing your parents into the middle of your marriage?
Here's a good question to ask yourself. Am I telling my parents this to get their advice, or am I just trying to get them to agree with me?
Oh, that's interesting. Because if you're always complaining to your parents about your spouse, you're not only hurting your marriage, you're also putting your parents in a tough spot.
Exactly. And it can create a lot of tension in the family. So before you run to your parents for validation, think about whether this is something you and your spouse can work out on your own. Maybe even talk to a therapist if you need help.
Good point. A therapist can be a neutral party who can help you work through things without involving your families. But if you decide to talk to your parents about something that's going on in your marriage, how can you do it in a way that's respectful to everyone involved?
The key is to focus on the problem, not the person. And try to avoid saying things that sound like you're blaming your spouse for everything.
So instead of saying, my wife is so messy, she never cleans up after herself, maybe it's better to say, we're having some trouble agreeing on how to keep the house clean and I'm feeling overwhelmed. I don't know how to talk to her about it.
Much better. You're explaining the situation without making it sound like your spouse is the bad guy. And remember, it's not just what you say, it's what you do. If your actions don't match your words, it's going to send mixed messages.
Like if you always cancel plans with your spouse to do something with your parents, it shows that your actions don't match up with saying your spouse comes first.
Exactly. So pay attention to those little things because they can really make a difference.
It's about being aware of your choices and making sure they line up with what you say is important to you. And sometimes that means saying no to your parents, even if it's hard.
It is hard, but it's important for setting those healthy boundaries we talked about earlier.
And sometimes you have to be really firm with those boundaries, especially if your parents are difficult.
Right, if your parents are always criticizing you or trying to control you or trying to undermine your marriage, you might need to take stronger measures to protect yourself and your relationship. That could mean talking to them less, setting stricter rules, or even getting professional help to deal with them.
Wow, sometimes love means having to make tough choices.
It does. But it's important to put your own well-being and the health of your marriage first. So we've talked about a lot in this deep dive. We started with that whole leave and cleave idea, then talked about how important the parent-child bond is, and then we got into the psychology of it all. Plus, we talked about communication, boundaries, and how to handle those crazy life events that throw everything off balance.
It's been a lot to think about. But ultimately, like you said before, there's no one right answer to the question of who comes first. It depends on you, your partner, and your family.
Exactly. The important thing is to communicate, respect each other, be willing to adapt, and have a lot of patience.
It's a journey, not a destination. So, as you continue to figure out what that balance looks like for you, here's something to think about. How do you define the ideal balance between your spouse and your family? And what values will guide your decisions as you navigate this whole love, loyalty, and commitment thing?
Great questions. Keep those conversations going and keep diving deep.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.